The world is full of mysterious, unexplainable phenomena. Many inexplicable things provide inspiration for people in creating monsters of all shapes and sizes. The SCP universe is well known for its extremely powerful, baffling monsters. Horror movies often receive the same kind of praise. However, some horror movie monsters are too straightforward, or belong to an expanded universe of their very own. So today we're going to take some lesser known horror movie monsters and slot them into a foundation framework. That's right, it's time for the top 5 horror monsters that could be SCPs. Let's get to it. Coming in at number 5, we've got the Santas from Rare Exports. There's already one terrifying SCP based on the mythology surrounding wintertime holidays and naked men with beards. Why not add another? This one is a little more silly though, and I could see the Foundation stepping up and taking over the Santa training and distribution operation. I should probably explain exactly what I'm talking about though, right? Rare Exports is a hilarious and wild Finnish Christmas horror movie. Out in the middle of nowhere, there's a small village of Finns trying to eke out a living. They prepare for a large-scale reindeer hunt every year in order to stock up on food and to make enough money to keep the village in the black. However, a nearby mining operation has unearthed an ancient threat killing all the reindeer. What could possibly awaken after thousands of years and annihilate entire reindeer populations? An enormous, eldritch, Krampus-like Santa and his army of terrifying, naked elves. The elves seem abnormally accustomed to the cold, able to trek through these snowy forests in the nude without sustaining any sort of cold-based ailments. And the warehouse-sized horned Santa is in a class of its very own. If this were to exist in the SCP universe, I could see it playing out like this. A discovery log details the events of Rare Exports, the mining operation unearthing the ancient threat, the elves kidnapping all of the local children and trying to thaw Santa, the locals destroying the giant Santa with explosives, and then the elves being left with no direction. Then the Foundation could swoop in and contain all these anomalous elves, amnesticizing the villagers who began training the bearded creatures to be real-life Santa Clauses. They would then likely set up a research lab near the village and begin containing all the strange dudes. A cover story about wolves would be distributed to keep the reindeer story quiet, and eventually they would lock down all the elves. I suppose the gigantic Santa would be given the SCP designation, with all the elves being designated -01. At that point, they could be classified safe, as Santa was neutralized, leaving the elves with little to no free will. This makes them easy to contain and even potentially retrainable by the Foundation. Many future Sub-Zero missions could benefit with the addition of one of Santa's little helpers. It's a goofy tale meant to fit in with local legends about Santa, but there's something about Rare Exports that makes me think these little nude dudes would fit right in amongst the other anomalies. Coming in at number 4, we've got Philip and Possum from Possum. This would be an interesting SCP as well. See, one can't exist without the other, and from how the movie plays out, we really can't be sure if Possum is really supernatural or if Philip is just seeing things. But if we were to induct these two into the SCP wiki, we'd have to assume that Possum is indeed an anomaly and feeds off of Philip. So both of them together would make up the entry. I guess Possum would be the main entry and Philip would be another -01, which sort of makes sense, right? This strange, spidery puppet with a man's face moving about, acting of its own accord? Anyone who encountered either Philip or Possum would likely have to be amnesticized, as people who encounter them often end up missing or dead. The backstory of Philip could be explored through interviews, whether with him while in containment or folks who may have run into him over the years. But the real anomaly would definitely be Possum, this terrible little creature, black as sin. The Possum poem would definitely be added as an addendum, sort of explaining the story behind it, and the way it operates might go unexplained too. Every time Philip tries to rid himself of Possum in the movie, it comes back to torment him. This leads to darker and darker discoveries, which would make for some excellent additions to the file on the duo. They'd probably end up classified as Euclid, seeing as Philip would probably be glad to remain under Foundation custody, while Possum would influence him to attempt escape from time to time. That and Possum would appear in classically creepy spots throughout the site they're being held at without explanation. Definitely a creepy and mysterious addition to the wiki. Coming in at number 3, we've got the Splinter monster from Splinter. Now here is a Keter class anomaly if I've ever seen one. This one feels like a mix between the flesh that hates and the thing. Is there any way to connect it to the Sarkics? Maybe it's an alien addition to our world, unexplainable by any of our technologies. Either way, this feels like a first or second series SCP with a lot of freaky potential. Like, this thing appears out of nowhere, in the middle of nowhere, and causes absolute mayhem at a gas station. This strange, dark, splintery infection seems to be able to take over any warm-blooded living being and then uses that new host to spread even further. Anyone infected by it begins to act irrationally and violently, seeking out warmth and attacking. It assimilates beings into horrific, spine-covered abominations that can either act as one massive whole or as independent little pieces, which would make it very hard to contain. I could see entire townships being taken over by the Splinter infection before the Foundation manages to contain the spread. Of course, plenty of amnestic and incendiary protocols would have to be put to good use, and lots of MTF exploration logs are a must. I want to see some well-equipped personnel carefully pick their way through a Splinter-filled apartment complex, fighting off terrifying amalgamations as they attempt to figure out the source. Maybe some D-class experimentation logs too, with the Foundation doing some potentially unethical experiments into the nature of the transformations and the range at which they can detect suitable hosts. With the way the movie ended, spoilers by the way, all those additional Splinter corpses in the woods could have found brand new areas to take over. Let it spread far enough unimpeded and you could have a massive problem on your hands. A few Splinters in the major cities and extinction events aren't too far off. Coming in at number 2, we've got The Color Out of Space from The Color Out of Space. Out of all of the famous Lovecraftian phenomena, I think that the pinkish glow fits in best with the rest of the stuff in the SCP Wiki. A strange energy descending from space and changing reality within its area of influence? That just works, you know? There's so much potential for discovery logs, history deep dives, and interviews with survivors. This is Keter for sure, especially as it tends to totally alter the minds and forms of those exposed to it. How do you contain a color, an energy? How do you ensure that it doesn't keep spreading? That's for the O5 Council to decide in the end, I suppose. There are plenty of SCPs that seem to have a lot of sway over humans already, from the snow orb that beckons to people like a frozen siren to the fascinating nothingness of the void. I just think that this vision of a world-altering mindless presence is perfect for the SCP universe. Hell, it could even be some sort of 001 proposal, with the color being the basis for all sorts of anomalies. A whole new hub dedicated to the impacts of a rosy glow. And finally, at number 1, we've got the Killing Field from They Remain. This might not be a monster per se, but there's enough strangeness here to write pages and pages of stuff. There are plenty of SCP entries that are areas that seem to function outside of our understanding of reality. The Killing Field is a perfect example of somewhere that would fit in really well. In They Remain, 2 scientists are sent out to a secluded area in which cult activity used to take place. They're to study the land and figure out if something there is indeed influencing those who visit to act in certain ways. Already you can see the SCP potential. Diary entries detailing the initial boredom which devolves into insanity thanks to some unexplainable events. If we were to make this an SCP, we could probably take all the anomalies at face value and say yes, those did indeed happen. The cult that staked out here for a while was indeed influenced by powers beyond our comprehension. The researchers did experience oddities, including unexplainable presences making noise around camp, strange animal remains being discovered, and the capture of horrific creatures on multiple cameras. Foundation would have to eventually set up a perimeter around the Killing Field and ensure that nobody else enters, save for research purposes. It could be a fascinating and truly creepy entry full of historical information, exploration logs, and various recurring sub-anomalies. Plus, the futuristic tents used by the scientists really feel like they'd be used by the Foundation. Seriously, if you're looking for an SCP-ish movie with hints of Lovecraft, check out They Remain. Right on. Hopefully I didn't ruffle too many feathers by implying that all of these should be SCPs. Of course, SCPs should be original ideas and we don't need to extend the reach of the Foundation any further, but it's fun to imagine and classify. So what do you think of the list? Do my picks fit in with other anomalies? What horror monsters do you think would make for a good SCP? Make sure you let me know down in the comments. Speaking of comments, let's take a look at some of your more ideological ones from the top 5 scariest horror books of 2020. Cobra Raptor says the scariest story of 2020 is the non-fiction history of the year, and we're still living it. I wonder how many books will be written on this in the future. Prep For It says books beat e-readers / phones and Kindles. While I personally agree, I do have a preference for books, I think there are plenty of uses for e-readers, etc., especially for folks who have a tough time getting their hands on the books that they want. Kazcat Eliza says this is a good list. My mother's house is very scary. My mother is a very sinister woman. Usually folks say that kind of stuff about their in-laws. And Thunder Kitten with the Smoke says the scariest book I know is my math book. Ooh, equations, formulas. Did that raise the scare factor of this video? And Steve Duncan says, wait, what? There were books released last year? Industry waits for no one. And that's all the time we have for today. I'm going to put on an animal mask and enter a crime den. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.